The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a free and open platform for theater makers worldwide. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Freak show is a term with some ugly historical and cultural resonances today, but in the 19th century it was an immensely popular form of entertainment. Dr. Matt DiCintio has been studying the freak show, particularly in the context of its 18th century origins and its relation to race, and he joins us on the show today. Matt, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
First off, what was the freak show, and what do we mean when we use that term, freak?
I think it's important to understand that any time a historian uses the term freak show, we should understand the word freak to be in quotation marks. And so, of course, the word does indeed have a negative connotation. Historians use it as shorthand for the display of any person who had any sort of biological or physiological difference, anomaly, anything about their body that was different than what the historian Rosemary Garland Thompson referred to as people who are normates. So people who have expected, quote unquote, normal bodies. And people who have had different bodies have been on display for millennia. The Romans made dwarfs, quote unquote, so little persons fight in the Colosseum, and the tradition continues up to this day with any sort of show you might prefer on TLC, whether it's My 600-Pound Life or The Little Couple, or there are many others. So the interest, sometimes prurient, sometimes sexual, of seeing people with different bodies has been a hallmark of human curiosity for millennia.
Now, we're talking about the end of the 18th century and going into the 19th century. What kind of cultural and intellectual things were happening in that period that helped to give rise to the freak show?
So I study specifically early America, and end of the 18th century, of course, was when the colonies became the United States. And throughout the 18th century, irrespective of the founding of the United States, there was great anxiety among people living in the colonies, living in America, about what kind of world they were living in. And there were many European natural philosophers, as they were called then, who assumed and wrote extensively about the idea that the climate of North America was deleterious to the human condition. The French natural philosopher, the Comte de Buffon, spent 50 years publishing volume after volume about how the climate of North America was dangerous. And so there was great anxiety about the people living in America about what kind of world they were living in. And of course, when I say those people, I'm talking about the white people. And anytime there was any sort of Native American encounter or insurrection or battle, that only enhanced the idea among British Americans primarily that the world they were living in was not safe. And it reached comical proportions. There's a great little book by an historian, Lee Dugetkin, I believe is his name, about the attempts and the lengths to which Thomas Jefferson went to prove that the North American climate was in fact not harmful. And he went to great lengths to find the largest moose that he could to send to France to the Comte de Buffon to prove that basically, look how big this moose is. Told you it's not dangerous here and that the climate is not harmful to us. And the story about how the moose was lost, it was found again. I mean, it was farcical. And the punchline is Buffon actually never recorded his reaction to it. And in part, this was what partly fueled the expedition that he sent Lewis and Clark on. It was not only to discover the land, but also in his instructions to them, he was greatly concerned about whether they would find giants somewhere in the middle of America. And as the 18th century rolled on and you get into questions about American independence, this only more greatly enhanced the anxiety about what kind of world are we going to live in? What kind of people are we going to become? Thomas Paine famously asked, are we going to be a nation of white men or of black men? So in an attempt to exercise that anxiety, the ability to see other people who were not like them, quote unquote, was a way of working out that anxiety. And if they could see a freak, they could reassure themselves that they were in fact on the right track. As many historians have noted, this was also the underlying urge that spurred Victorian era freak shows as the middle class rose and as people were looking for ways to coalesce and identify themselves as something rather and using the other as the marker of what they were not.
You've mentioned sort of this role that race plays. It sounds like it's kind of always lurking there as a factor in the popularity of the freak show. Could you tell us a little bit more about the specifics of that? And in particular, can you tell us the story of a man named Harry Moss?
Sure. So there was great anxiety as the nation was founded about who would be counted as Americans. And of course, there was great consternation about what to do with the slave population and with the presence of black men, women, and children who were not slaves, and what kind of population America would have. And, right, this is how we get the 3/5 compromise, right? It's not, and to be sure, it's not that black men, women, and children, that slaves were counted as 3/5 a person. It was 3/5 the population for the purposes of apportioning representation. So there was great anxiety about what to do with the black population. And there were many, many, many people who wrote about this. Thomas Jefferson, perhaps most famously in his Notes on the State of Virginia from 1780-81, pondered this and came down with the idea that, yes, we should free them, but basically, are they smart enough to live on their own? And by keeping them as slaves, are we doing them a service? So these are obviously white supremacist strategies. And there were events throughout, particularly the late 18th century, that exacerbated these anxieties. The slave uprisings in the Caribbean brought more and more, quote unquote, colored bodies into America, particularly in large cities like Philadelphia. So among all this, in the mid-1790s, Harry Moss put himself on display at a tavern in Philadelphia. Harry Moss was a native from Virginia. He was a free man, and he had what we would likely diagnose today as something, as a form of vitiligo. So a pigment-deficient condition where dark skin begins to turn white in patches on the body, if not completely. So he put himself on display as a freak, and he was among one of the most famous, probably the most famous, of what they at the time called white Negroes. There was a substantial interest in the 18th century in white Negroes, so black men, women, and children who either had vitiligo or were albino, and this was not limited to America, all across the West. And so he put himself on display, and many, many people wrote about him and went to see him, paying him to see him, touch him, feel his skin, make observations about what his skin looked like, what kind of family background he came from. He was of mixed heritage. The reports vary, but he may have come from grandparents who were Native American, perhaps Irish. It's not clear. The reports vary, but he did have skin as a black man that was beginning to turn white. And as people went and visited him and spoke to him, they, of course, remarked on how articulate he was. And the fascinating thing about his display is that, unlike many other freaks of the era, and subsequently, most notably P.T. Barnum, Harry Moss did not have a handler. He was not managed by anybody. He put himself on display, charged admission, probably splitting it with a tavern owner, and let people talk with him, touch him, examine his body, his black body that was turning white, and took their money. And one doctor who examined him and interviewed him made many observations about his sex life, He questioned him about the smell of his urine. He questioned him about when he got up in the morning, did any of his blackness rub off on the sheets? It did not, and apparently his urine smelled fine. But people, abolitionists in particular, were very taken with this, and one person explicitly noted, if it's so easy for Harry Moss to turn white, why would it be so difficult for us to turn black? So Harry Moss's appearance in Philadelphia and all the accounts about him were really this flashpoint about questions about what kind of nation were we going to become and who were we going to count as citizens of the new republic. And what's all the more remarkable about his display was that the tavern was right around the corner from the London Coffee House, which was Philadelphia's slave market. And when potential owners would go to a slave market, they would examine slaves in quite in depth in terms of their behavior, but also their physical health. And they would inspect them in ways that were quite intrusive. And the preference for slave owners was that their slaves be as black as possible. They believed that the darker the skin, the more healthy they would be, the better worker they would be. So while this was taking place around the corner, Harry Moss was putting himself on display and submitting himself to physical examinations that were not all that different from how slaves would be examined. So it's this really remarkable summer in the 1790s when this one man who put himself on display really served as a focal point for anxiety about the racial makeup of the early United States.
Another instance of an individual whose race factors into her prominence in a freak show is someone named Saartjie Baartman. And I was wondering, why was her time being displayed as the so-called Venus Hottentot so important to the development of the freak show?
So we often look at Baartman's exhibition as what really inaugurated the 19th century craze for freak shows. She was from South Africa. She was brought to London in 1810 and put on display, and by all accounts had a completely miserable life. Susan Laurie Parks has written a lovely play about this called Venus. And what's remarkable about Baartman is that we don't even know that that's her real name. We actually don't know what her real name was. Saartjie Baartman is a sort of British English bastardization of what it could have been. So she died shortly thereafter, and then for the next 2 centuries she was on display. She had an autopsy, and then her body was put on display, and then her skeleton was on display into the 20th century, and I believe it was in 2000, about 10 years ago, I don't quite remember the date, the French museum that housed her body, finally sent her back to South Africa where she was interred. So her display in 1810 and the few years after really inaugurated what was the, I hesitate to say golden era, but I think your audience will understand what I mean, of freak shows. Not long after, P.T. Barnum rose to prominence when he displayed a slave by the name of Joyce Heth, who he claimed was 180 years old and was George Washington's nurse. And so that's how he originally came to fame. And then thereafter, as Barnum collected more and more people who were physically different, and many others did too, the freak show really became this venue where people in increasingly urbanized places could go and coalesce as white people, seeing something different and therefore knowing that they were going to be okay. And many of them had miserable lives. Many of them became quite wealthy and certainly quite famous by their exhibitions. Charles Stratton, who was remembered as Tom Thumb, became incredibly famous. He was a little person. His visit to meet the Queen of England was covered around the world. His wedding to another little person was on the cover of, I think it was Harper's during the Civil War. Their wedding bumped the war off the front page. So they became incredibly famous, very wealthy, and many of them quite miserable by the end of their lives. There were many little people that P.T. Barnum displayed who wound up just drinking themselves to death. And they all had names like General Stratton. So Tom Thumb was General Tom Thumb, and there was Major Moat, and there was Major Adam, right? All these the superlative coupled with their smallness.
You also write about an individual named Emma Leach. Can you tell us about her and why you set up a little bit of a contrast between her and Bartman?
Sure. Emma Leach was a woman with some form of dwarfism. She was called the Maiden Dwarf in accounts of the time. She appeared once in Boston in 1782 and was reported on widely. There's a very famous picture of her an engraving of her that graced the cover of several almanacs of the time. People originally thought that Paul Revere did the engraving. He did not. But she was on display once in Boston in 1782, and people were very, very fascinated with her. And she had, it's dangerous to diagnose in hindsight, but she had several ailments. She couldn't walk. She had to be carried. She had some complications with the alignment of her spine. So her chin was very close to her chest. So she could not articulate very well. But she was apparently quite a character and would love to tease the people who went to see her. And she was on display in the home of a widow, and people would go and pay their entrance fee, half price for children, to go and look at her and try to converse with her. The most extensive account about her talks about how ornery she could be during her presentations, but also notes that the author of that article apologizes to his readers that he could not offer as many details about her as they may want, because she would not allow a minute examination, which probably means she wouldn't take her clothes off to let them investigate her genitals. And this represents one of the pervasive questions about freak shows. There's a scholar by the name of Elizabeth Grosh who wrote about the sex lives of freaks, that what we want to know is how do they do it. So it's no mistake that they refer to her as the Maiden Dwarf. One of the issues with thinking about and talking about freak shows, certainly with the rise of disability studies in the past several decades, has been the issue of, is there any way in which the freaks were able to find agency in their performances? Was there any way that they were able to do something more than get stared at? Was there any way in which they were able to stare back? So I'm fascinated with Emma Leach because I think that her refusal to let them all know everything that they wanted to know was her way of saying, no, this is the one thing that I get to have control over. And after her exhibition in Boston, she retired home to her small town in Massachusetts and was never on display again. And she never appears in the archive again until her death several years later. I did do some noodling around on Ancestry.com, which is how I found her family's death records. And we all thought that she only appeared once in Boston in 1782, but newspapers misspelled her last name, and they misspelled her first name, perhaps because she couldn't pronounce her name fully. She was on display once before in Salem in 1781 and was only there for a brief time. There's no indication about why she appeared there and why she appeared again in 1782 in Boston. There's a reference to gentlemen convincing her, but the distinction I draw between her and Bartman is that at some point Emma Leach decided, and had the power to decide, that she was not interested in being stared at, and Bartman really didn't have that option. It's also worth pointing out that Bartman was black and Emma Leach was white.
What happened to the freak show, and in what ways does the freak show continue to influence the ways that we think about disability, physical difference, perhaps race, even to this day?
Scholars of freak shows point to the 1950s, right, where freak shows had their demise because basically the public got a conscience and thought maybe this wasn't a good idea. There are freak shows that still exist. Famously one, there was in Venice Beach. There are many fairs that continue to have freak shows. I've been to several real. Mostly, though, they're fake. The mermaid I saw, I don't believe was a real mermaid. And many of the freak shows feature people who can do amazing acts and are not people who have some sort of physical difference that we can gawk at. That being said, I mentioned TLC earlier, and it's on TLC that we continue to see the freak show in all its traditional complications. The thing I show my students when I teach this is there's a clip from The Little Couple, which is a show several seasons long. I believe it's ended now, about a couple. They're little people, and they've adopted children who are also little people. And the show follows them throughout their normal lives. The wife has cancer at some point. The husband has a lot of physical problems that accompany people with dwarfism, a lot of back issues, so it follows them through their surgeries. But there's one episode where the family is doing nothing but practicing a fire drill. And people going through surgeries like back problems and cancer, those are TV shows that we've seen before. That was, TLC did that when it was called the Learning Channel. But, right, there's this episode where this family is practicing a fire drill, and there's absolutely nothing about it that is in any way extraordinary or in any way different than any family may practice a fire drill, except they're little people. So the freak show is alive and well. We just don't call it that anymore. Right, as I mentioned, in somewhere around the 1940s, 50s, the public got a conscience and thought, maybe we shouldn't stare at people. We still stare at people. And what the freak show demonstrates is that we are both extremely compelled by people with physical difference, and by we, I mean normates, people who are not marked by physical difference. So we are extremely compelled by them. And on the other hand, at the same time, it is really, really easy to forget them. So it's easy to turn off TLC after you've enjoyed your 2-hour special of My 600-Pound Life. It was easy to go to the freak show to see Fyodor Jeftichu, who went by Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. He had hypertrichosis, I believe is, so excessive hair. Or to go see, the Bearded Lady, and then to go home, having been entertained, and forget about it. And this dual notion of both being compelled and having amnesia persists today. The movie The Greatest Showman does this extraordinarily and unfortunately very well. So we'll set aside the historical inaccuracies, and the movie, of course, completely ignores Barnum's rise to prominence by parading a slave woman around the country. And okay, fine, we can, get our dander up about historical inaccuracies, and we should. What concerned me most about the film was it's entertaining as hell. And on the other hand, you watch the credits roll, and all of the freaks who are in the freak show, we know who they are. We know their names, and they are listed in the credits only as Dancer Oddity or Human Oddity. They never name them beyond Stratton, beyond Tom Thumb. And I was stunned that they would do that. These were very famous people. It's not hard to find out who they were. It's on Wikipedia, for God's sake. So the simultaneous ability to be compelled by freaks and to utterly forget them. Well, a great example of this in the ongoing debate about the elimination of plastic straws. So, yeah, it's great to eliminate plastic straws in an attempt to protect the environment. But what a lot of people who are behind these campaigns forget is that a lot of people need straws in order to be able to drink because of different physical conditions that they may have. And there are issues with, get on my little high horse here, there are issues with straws that are not plastic that people with some physical conditions cannot handle. Pasta straws, paper straws can cause choking, glass straws can be dangerous. So plastic straws can really be the only other option. And we forget about that when we have conversations about let's protect the environment and get rid of plastic straws. People may counter with, okay, one, can't they carry their own straws? So, okay, so now they have to do something else for our benefit. And two, can't they ask for one? they can, and then mark themselves again as other. So even in debates where many of us could agree, let's get rid of plastic straws, we forget how ableist we can be. It's really easy to forget people with physical difference, no matter how much we are entertained by them.
We'll post additional resources in our show notes that will let you explore the freak show and how 19th century audiences encountered and thought of physical difference. Matt, thank you so much for explaining some of the complicated history and cultural dynamics of the freak show to us.
Thank you, Mike.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.